Nano Harmony workshop, the third Nano Harmony workshop taking place. We have the roundtable of the OECD Test Guidelines program and stakeholder involvement as the topic. And we will do it this afternoon in some steps. In the beginning, all of the participants of the roundtables will briefly introduce themselves and tell us about how they are involved in test guideline development into the OECD work, and maybe a few words in the beginning already, what are their experiences and their feeling around OECD test guidelines here and the developments. Then there will be a brief introduction from my side towards OECD stakeholder involvement and Nano Harmony stakeholder involvement, and what we think about what do we actually define as stakeholders. And I will also introduce briefly several phases we have actually defined within Nano Harmony for the test guideline developments. And then we have about 4 rounds of discussion, because we split it into 4 parts, where we will have an exchange between the roundtable partners on the 4 phases. And what are the differences of stakeholder involvement at these different phases. It all will then be summarized in the end, and that's it. There will be a summary of the first day, Elizabeth finalizing the day, and this is what we are looking really forward to now with the roundtable discussion on stakeholder involvement and OECD test guidelines. A short question, Michael, are you present?
We can't see him, but I'm just emailing him. So I think if we just start slowly, we'll try our best.
I cannot set the pace, but I think we can start with Anne, being the person at OECD working on test guideline development. And Anne, you may briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for the invitation to take part in this roundtable this afternoon. So my name is Anne Gourmelon. I'm the principal administrator of the OECD Test Guidelines program. I am having this role for now about 9 years, I think, I remember. And so in this capacity, I'm responsible for managing the program from the Secretariat perspective. We are a team of about 6 people. Not everyone is full-time working on test guidelines. But you know very well Mar. Mar is partly on test guidelines and partly on other issues related to the safety of nanomaterials. I have other colleagues working on other topics, and I'm overseeing all of that work. This covers test guidelines development, maintenance of test guidelines, which means updating them from time to time. This is also very important. Also developing guidance documents and other types of documents like review papers, validation study reports, and just to say that all of that work is led by member countries, right? So we very much rely upon the voluntary contribution, whether in kind or in terms of bringing projects forward to the test guidelines program. And the reason for that, it's because these documents are intended to satisfy regulatory needs. and the member countries are those who best know what are their needs and how to fulfill them, developing standard documents, right? So in that capacity, we organize the work of the program. We have a group of which is called the Working Party of the national coordinators of the test guidelines program. They meet once a year at the OECD in Paris. And this year we are also having a workshop later this week, and to be beyond just the regular work, to also start reflecting on how to adapt some of our processes running the program, processes and practice. And as you know, we also have a large number of expert groups, and many of you are working with MAR within dedicated expert groups in relation to nanomaterials safety testing. And I must say that the community of nanomaterials is very well organized through many European funded projects as well. We have to acknowledge the important role that EU funding has been playing over the last years in organizing European research for developing standards for the safety testing of nanomaterials to meet the European regulatory needs, right? So with that, I think I covered what I wanted to say for this introduction.
Thanks a lot, Anne, and thanks a lot for your words concerning the activities coming from Europe towards the Working Party of Manufacturing Nanomaterials. And certainly we were causing also some work to your team. But I can give it back that it is a great collaboration and it's great with you, but also internationally. It's absolutely gorgeous how their collaboration and the common effort is done there. So with these words, just introducing you on. And hello, Michael, good to see you. And we are just in the introduction round. You will be the last one, but I hope you don't mind. But I would like to continue. And before we continue, I think I forgot to introduce to everybody that this session will be recorded. So please be aware of what you are saying. No, I think we can freely speak here on the topics we are discussing today. And especially Ma, you may introduce yourself now and your role.
Yeah, now that you scare me with the recording, I have to introduce myself, but thank you so much, Thomas. So my name is Mar Gonzalez. I'm also part of the OECD Secretariat. As Anne mentioned, I mean, she already explained you what we do within the test guidelines program, but perhaps I can complement that I'm also working for the Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials, which as you will see later and that you have seen in previous webinars, is like the stage of all this work. I've been working with the WPMN since its establishment. I think it's 16 years ago. And what we try to do is really to align the practices with nanomaterials to the rest of chemicals. And I think this is one of the reasons that much emphasis has been done in test guidelines, because it's one of the main areas. I think it's essential for protection of the environment, human health, securing innovation, really like the work on international harmonization and standardization. So the characterization of nanomaterials has been a big challenge. And I think certainly with this, the Malta initiative that was introduced briefly this morning by Thomas, triggered a broad range of test guidelines and guidance documents on nanomaterials. And as it has also been shown in a table where you can see all the projects that have been completed and are on the way. The way that I see our role in OECD is really about building consensus, is facilitating this consensus between the different stakeholders. I mean, I work with experts on FISCEM, on ecotox, on human health. You can imagine that the expertise is very technical. So I try to be humble myself and simply try to accompany all the leads and all the stakeholders to find some consensus. And perhaps I've been spoiled in one sense, and is that I within the WPMN, we really start the discussion of needs, emerging issues, test guideline needs, whether we're ready, whether we need to have some literature review in advance to have the establishment or to develop a project proposal for the WNT. But also it has been a pleasure to see how the nano expertise has been transferred into this test guidelines world, and now they walk on their own. I mean, they don't need me, which is, I guess, it's a really nice success story. But more to discuss, more to improve, and I think that's why we are all here today. So thank you so much for the invite.
Thank you very much, Mar, and you certainly know it wouldn't work as good without you. So marvelous what you are doing there. Tim, it is a pleasure also to welcome you. And if I recall correctly, you were chair of the WNT some former times, so you have quite some experience, but introduce yourself, please.
Sure, thanks so much. Appreciate the invitation to be here, and good afternoon. So I'm Tim Singer. I'm the National Coordinator for Canada for the Test Guidelines Program, and a member of the Bureau of the Working Party alongside my colleague Michael, who is our current chair. I did fulfill that role for a few years, which ended this past April at our most recent meeting. So I have been involved with test guidelines for a period of time longer than I'd like to admit. Probably dinosaurs roamed the earth when I started the process of my engagement with the program. But certainly in the context of my current role as national coordinator, I've been fulfilled that function now for probably about 10 years. And I've been involved in all phases of test guideline development, from the conceptualization through to the interpretation from a regulatory context. Probably worth mentioning, I'm based in Canada at Health Canada, which is the national Ministry of Health. And in that context, my predominant expertise is in human health, but I work closely with colleagues at the Environment Ministry to fulfill sort of the entire suite of the area of emphasis of the Test Guidelines Program. So the role of the National Coordinator is really to serve as the national focal point for feeding into the program, both scientific expertise and review capacity. So in that context, we're involved both in terms of mobilizing our laboratory capacity and the academic sector to the extent that that exists in different countries. It has different levels of importance, but also representing the national position at the working party meetings, as Anne mentioned, that occur at the governance table once per year. So that's really the function of the national coordinator. So I'm quite excited to partake in the discussion today and get some additional thoughts about stakeholder engagement, because that's always an area of interest. Are we reaching the right people? Are all the right people with the expertise that could play in particular issues involved? And how can we do a better job of reaching out and engaging the relevant scientific expertise? So thanks for this opportunity to engage in this discussion.
Our pleasure, Tim, and thanks for describing the job as good as you just did, so that we see really the relevance of this job as well. And I think, Susan, you are in a similar position, so you may continue and introduce yourself and what you're doing and your linkage to test guideline developments and test guidelines.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I hope I don't have any problems with the connection. Somehow my technique is not working as well as I thought it would, but yeah, I'm also national coordinator for Germany, and I'm in the position that I'm the coordinator for all sections, but the health section, which is the coordinator is Michael, who's here in the panel as well. And I've been working for the test guidelines program since 2005, and now since 2019 I'm the national coordinator, and I'm working at the Environment Agency in Germany, and I'm a biotechnology and ecotoxicology. Yes, my role as national coordinator. I, as the name says, oversee and coordinate all the work in the program of the working party of the national coordinators. And in that role, it's my role to propose new projects to the work plan that are led by Germany or co-led by Germany. And we assess the proposed new projects from the other member countries. And this is always very important to get the national position, as Tim already mentioned. And I also coordinate the German-led projects. So I inform all the experts in the project on timelines, on the processes and procedures, and communicate with the lead experts, with the co-leads and the Secretariat, of course, very important to get the processes running and solve issues that arise during projects. You never know which project is the same. So it's very, very interesting after all the years I've been working for that program still, yeah. I also try to participate in the expert group meetings as far as possible, because I cannot, there are so many expert groups, so I cannot be part of all of them, but to some I'm participating, and I also sometimes support the drafting of the documents, also help, as Tim said, with the lab communications and things, but most of the time we have lead experts to do that, and they also prepare the responses to comments documents, which are a very, very important part of the process, because it all has to be very transparent. And as Mara said, it's all about coming to a joint understanding of how a test guideline should be in the end, that everybody can agree upon that test guideline or the guidance document or the coordinators of the work program together. So developing national positions is very important for me. On all the commenting rounds, I'm collecting all comments of the national experts in Germany in the specific field. There, it's, of course, it's important for me to know whether I have collected from the right experts, from all stakeholders also. And yes, and I send the comments with a national position to OECD, and they then distribute it again to the lead countries. So yeah, that's my role, and I'm very happy to be here and to to discuss with you the stakeholder roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. And you, like Tim, already mentioned the importance of experts being somehow involved in this work. So one of the stakeholder groups has been mentioned already. And Susanne, you were right. There were sometimes in between moments where the connection was not so smooth, but at least I could understand you quite well. Just to the others, if that is too disturbing, we may think of maybe shutting off the video while you are speaking. Otherwise, please stay as you are in the moment, happily. And now Susanne already mentioned Michael, and Michael, you can introduce yourself and your responsibilities with regard to the expert level, but also, as I think you are also the chair of the WNT, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And thanks for the invitation for this important activity here. I'm at the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment in the Department of Experimental Toxicology and CeBIT, and which is also the home of the German Center for the Protection of Laboratory Animals. So the development and validation of new methods has actually been the center of this department for quite some time. So when I joined the BFR like 14 years ago, time passes by fast. We actually, my former boss already worked for quite some time for the OECD, Manfred Liebsch. I don't know, some of you might still know him. And so I had to start right away to support or to work in expert groups. And we were working on the first guidance document for an IATA on skin irritation, corrosion. So that went all very fast and was very exciting. And since 2016, I'm the national coordinator for the test guideline program. So it's actually not that long ago. And since, so Tim chaired the last session of the WNT. So I have the honor to chair the next one, which will be in a couple of days. Our position for my task in the test guideline program really is that we are coordinating any activity related to test guidelines in the section of human health, as Susanne already said. So it does sound not so much, but it's actually more or less 50-50. So even Susanne has 4 sections and we have only 1. The number of projects is actually equally divided. And so we as already Tim and Susanne said, the general responsibilities of national coordinators are, I guess, are clear now. And I think for the expert, developing a national position is actually not always as easy as one might think. So you reach out to all possible experts in different institutions or outside of the regulatory domain. But we also try to establish a kind of an expert group specifically for this program, external experts, and kind of orientating of what the UBA had already established years ago. And it's actually always a question if, I think, as Susanne said, if you have sufficient expertise or the right expert for each question available, if they have time to actually comment on a work proposal or test guideline proposal. This is actually a good, important issue and a difficult issue, also in respect to bias. If you have people from CROs or industry or regulatory agencies, they have different need. That is a very important question, how to define the international position. But also for the nanoparticles, obviously the case that Susanne is, for the physical chemical properties, she's in charge. But if we change test guideline for human health, we would be in charge. But we have very nice communication, so it's not really a problem to get a common position here. But so I'm looking forward to the discussion. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And just briefly to myself, I'm Thomas Kuhlbusch, the coordinator of NanoHarmony, in the role of the moderator today, not in the role of being a member of the German delegation to the WPMN. Our task within NanoHarmony was somehow also to look in and facilitate the work with all the TGs coming up, as Anne was already mentioning in the beginning. And that also gave us the opportunity to have a look into how we can best facilitate the work to MAR and to OECD and to UN, because this meant experts had to be involved. We had to reach out to different member countries and to keep the communication going. So that was the background where NanoHarmony comes into play here. And this is really also something I would like to stress here in the beginning. When we talk about stakeholder involvement and what we think at the different phases, it is not the task of the OECD, it's not the task of the member countries, it's not the task of the researchers, and it's all of us together which have to ensure that the stakeholder involvement is possible. So whenever we discuss at different stages, phases, stakeholder involvement, we should really see that it is a common task and not that we are saying this is the duty of you, I'm away. So it is something we have to find a good way and to see where we, as coming from the different ends, could participate more actively in the different steps, in the different phases. So this is a little bit of background, now into the wrong direction. You already saw this slide, which I was wondering how that happened. I think it must have been me. The aims of this round table is summarized briefly here that we, and now I have to move you away, understanding the current status of stakeholder engagement in the OECD test guideline development, which is a formal process, which certainly is different if you have a certain formality, but then there are certain possible barriers to stakeholder engagement and ways of improving or overcoming them. So having a look at some stages, for example, from the experts coming, how can we reach out better to scientists, whatsoever we will discuss later on. This is something which comes in this range. And we also would like to see how this, how improvements and widening of two-way communication with stakeholders is maybe possible in the future, or what else we find important in view of stakeholder involvement in the different phases. It's an open discussion. It's the result is open as well. So wait and see what will come. And it's also for me quite interesting. In the beginning, I already said that the discussion will go along different phases, and to allow everybody to see how the phases are set and how we from NanoHarmony see the different phases, which we have as a lead points for discussion today. It's very simple, as was, I think Tim mentioned it from the beginning. As he said, he went through all the different phases. Yes, the first point is always the initial idea. The initial idea can come from scientists, can come from regulatory needs, can come from all the different areas. So we have a phase 0, the initial idea. And then at a certain point of time, there's a decision, it is worth to go towards a test guideline, a guidance document towards harmonization and standardization. So this is where then this leads to the so-called, from our side, phase 1, which is the actual project proposal, which can be submitted to the WPMN or directly an SPSF, if I'm not mistaken, to the WNT. So then you have an agreement whether this is accepted or not. And we come to phase 2 and 3, which we somewhat put together, because you see from 0 to 4, we have 5 phases. I said to you, we will discuss 4 phases. So we somehow see phase 2 and 3 maybe as something belonging together. It's a technical development. And at the same time, the technical developments go towards the commenting and approval, which is a phase and part as outlined above at the OECD level. So where a test guidelines guidance document is drafted, where the results are presented, where the validation report is presented. So this is the phase 2 and 3, where we think we may put it together, but if the discussion comes to the point we have to separate it, certainly we can do that. And then we have a phase again, which is outside of OECD process, which is the use phase, the use in industry, the use by CROs. So where the test guideline guidance document shall be applied or can be applied. And certainly some experience are gathered there. And we have to see what role this phase actually plays in our discussion on stakeholder involvement. These are the phases, and you certainly can, if you like, in between ask questions to the phases where the ones ends or starts or make suggestion whether it's reasonable. You can put that into the chat. We are looking into the chat, and after each phase or at the end, we will open the questions, and questions which were raised in the chat will be brought up here. In this roundtable, so it is not only this kind of panel discussion between the roundtable members, but also there's an opening to questions from your end or remarks from your end, which will be possible after each phase. Stakeholder involvement, and now maybe Anne and Mar, you may be of different opinion here, but that's what we gathered here, and you can certainly comment later, comment here directly if you think. So for the OECD, we think defining stakeholders, it's mainly the national coordinators, the European Commission, the Secretariat, those who directly work and have an impact on the OECD. And within these communities, you also have the national experts, BIAC, TUEC, ICAPO, NGOs, which are part of the whole stakeholders being involved in the process of the OECD. So stakeholders at OECD are usually formally appointed as either national experts or part of the of an initiative body, BIAC, ICAPO, and NGOs. Experts report through their national coordinators, and they do have no defined role in phase 0 and phase 4. Would you, Anne and Mar, from your point of view, as from the OECD standpoint, agree to this view on stakeholders for the internal processes, certainly?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Maybe I can start, or do you want to start, Mar?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I complete.
Yes, I very much agree to this visual representation of the stakeholders. I would maybe add that there are additional entities, additional communities that get involved and get organized around specific topics, scientific issues, and that provide input into the test guidelines program that are not formally represented here on your diagram. If you want some examples, NanoHarmony is one, right? We have some other examples like the international coordination on alternatives to animal testing methods, ICATM, which is a coordination of validation centers for alternative methods. They are not formally represented. They don't get a seat as such at the table, but they are a community per se. Like NanoHarmony is a community, right? So you could maybe add to this diagram maybe different communities that are interested. They are stakeholders, but they don't as such get a seat at the table. I would like to add that. And I think you represented quite well the fact that national experts are, I would say, I would put maybe a direct link to the national coordinators because it's very much the territory of the national coordinators to create and maintain and develop their network of experts at the national level. So it's probably not where the Secretariat has a direct link, but we rely very much upon the national coordinators to organize that network, and we consult them, the national coordinators, directly. Only once a group of experts on a specific topic is established and organized, we start direct communication with the expert group, but otherwise a lot of the communication goes via the national coordinators. And I would say also lastly that there are some advisory groups and some interactions, some horizontal work that we do, for instance, with the WPMN, for example. We have also some horizontal collaborations and some, we share some advisory groups with some other working parties at the OECD, like the Working Party on Hazard Assessment. We have a common advisory group on molecular screening and toxicogenomics and the AOP program. which is not represented here. So in that constellation, I would say you have the main stakeholders, and there are some additional stakeholders that navigate around the program, I would say, right?
Yeah.
Very good, and thank you very much, Mar.
No, I think I was going to. I mean, I fully agree with Dan. There are some groups that have some, if you want, on a case-by-case basis, access, a different access to the work. And I guess the work on nanomaterials has been one of those examples with the Nano Harmony, with Go4Nano, where we have a lot of events jointly, and that allow broadening the expertise and the access to the work. But at the end of the day, we also try to encourage, once you have experts that are new to this system and that they're trying to be more engaged, to have this connection with the national coordinator, so they could have like a more official or regular or more sustainable participation in the work. So I think that's something that is very important. And I think both Susanne and Michael mentioned it about a national position. At the end of the day, when the test guidelines and the guidance documents are approved, it has to reflect a national position and the national position of all the countries around the table. So this is why we try to engage. But there is room for this enlargement of expertise on a case-by-case basis throughout the different implementation. Yeah.
Very good. So this is just to make clear, because we are coming from different ends, talking from Nano Harmony maybe, and you would see that in the slide thereafter, and the OECD, what stakeholder means. And that is the purpose why we introduce it here in this way. And certainly, Susanne, Michael, or Tim, would you like to add something to the point of view, looking from using the glasses of OECD and to the topic of stakeholders? Would you like to add something to this point, or do you think has everything been said already? I don't see any urgent movement, so I assume that everything was already said by you and Mar. And I continue, and this is where I feel certainly a little bit more familiar with, which is the Nano Harmony point of view on stakeholders, or which is not so much different. But I think it is something we try to be a little bit broader, this informal part. And that was nicely said, I think, by you and Mar, saying, okay, we have the formal and we add the informal as much as possible, and which is possible enabled by the national coordinators, by the formal process which is available. So therefore, certainly the Nano Harmony approach is less formal to stakeholders. We allow a little bit more granular approach, so we can define specific needs for different stakeholders and keep it to those. There's nothing where you need a stakeholder representative for everything. So like what is needed at the OECD level. So we are trying to be more inclusive in the way to bring in more different viewpoints, also from different perspectives from this one, and to cover also stages or phases which are not formally so much covered. So cover the formal TG process, which are the phases within the OECD, as well as the informal phases. We try to have a look into there, phase 0 and phase 4. Especially phase 0 is something which is important from the member countries' point of view and from the scientists coming from all over the world, to see regulators and scientists, this initial phase, to see where can we contribute, how can we contribute. This is something I think it's certainly beyond of the OECD processes. And so being a little bit more formal here, again, but naming it in a more clearer way, then we certainly have the academic scientists. They are very sector experts, and Michael has and Susanne, they had their different points. So Fuschem and environmental fate in transport, environmental toxicity, and then human hazard, which was Michael. So here we certainly have that one even wider if we go to specific test guidelines and to specific points of view. Industries, we certainly would like to reach out and see there it is important to have the large multinational companies, but also the SMEs very much involved, and to have a look into how do we can get them involved really. Expertise through BIAC is certainly for the large and multinational, and there are some others where there are also some of the smaller mediums, and the smaller medium enterprise as well as the large ones are the final users of the test guidelines, which then have to comply with, if needed, regulatory needs. The member states and member countries of OECDs are certainly a group of stakeholder groups we certainly see, but they, as already said before, are already officially represented at the OECD. Then we see also regulatory bodies, ECHA, NIOSH, EPA, EFSA, national regulators, so from Germany, from UK, from Canada, from Australia, from Japan, Korea, and whatever country. So those are certainly in stakeholder groups we also have to keep in mind, because they make also suggestion to what is regulatory needed, and they should be aware of what is actually possible for harmonization and standardization, leading over to the next stakeholder groups, the standardization bodies, which is OECD, but also CEN, ISO, and we have an exchange with these standardization bodies on a regular basis. And we have to certainly always link with these DGs and other industrial standards, which somehow link there from national, international bodies as well. Somehow linked to regulatory bodies, but certainly a different level are the policymakers, which are government authorities, which have a look into future regulation, which we also see as a stakeholder group, which we within NanoHarmony somehow think it's relevant at the different phases to have a look at it. CROs, which are the test laboratories who are actually using those test guidelines to fulfill the requirements, deliver the test to those who need the test for registration, for fulfilling any other requirements. So this is something I think a group which we also have to have a close eye on. And then we have these networks, informal groups, NGOs, can be more formal, the Malta Initiative, less formal, Nano Safety Cluster, other projects of international, from any other countries, and representatives of the civil society, which can also be and could be included. So this is how we somehow structured within our discussion within NanoHarmony, and we were thinking about how and whom shall we reach out to and whom do we have to involve. And these are the groups we identified as stakeholder groups. And certainly when we come to the discussion at the different phases, we can certainly add or define these groups differently or be more precise. Or do you have already now an addition to make for these types of stakeholder groups, which you think maybe we have overlooked some or some other comments from your side or from those taking part and listening to this roundtable discussion? There is no urgent sign coming. Okay, it's good, Michael, thank you. That's a good sign. So with that, we come to the discussion round. And this one is, as I said, we will do that in accordance to the different phases. We have the introduction now with the different phases, with the stakeholder groups. And here you see the phase 0. Phase 0 is the initial idea phase. So the phase from yes, you have something up to the phase where you say, okay, we are to the point that we can need and see the need for a standardization. The questions I pose here are always the same 3 questions, which are what are the main stakeholders that should be engaged during this phase and what role should they play? how well are the stakeholder groups currently engaged during this phase? And what could be done to improve the engagement of stakeholders for this phase? And just as a reminder for us and for all listening into it, we always have the different stakeholder groups from the NanoHarmony point of view as we put them together on the right-hand side so that we can keep those in mind. And thinking about the initial idea phase, this is something which comes from scientists, but this is certainly something like it must come to the project proposal or SPSF. So I could see this one maybe as a first person or people to ask here, who do you think is important? What are the main stakeholders? How is it currently done? And what could be improved, or where should we have a closer look at for those working at the WNT as national representatives? So maybe this is more a question for the start with to Tim, Susanne, and Michael. Does one of you would like to start to reply and give a comment on this, please? Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is it's probably a very especially important phase of test guideline development. Now, first of all, there are a lot of people who develop all kinds of methodologies for all kinds of scientific questions, but they don't even think about that the methods could also be used for, you know, hazard identification of chemicals in whatever context. The other thing is that people do think about it, but they do not know what they need to do to go to the next phase. So actually, we are contacted by people who developed a method, and then they ask us what they should do, or if it would be interesting for the OECD Test Guideline program. And I mean, one thing these people or researchers are not really aware of are regulatory needs, so to speak. So they're not really clear how this method could be used. So I think it's very important. One is to support them to identify potential uses, you know, to fit them to regulatory needs to some then to ask them. I mean, really, the question of standardization is then very important, but a lot of people, researchers, are not really aware of. They are continuously progressing the method. So also to have people who are familiar with standardization and yeah, any phase of validation, so to speak, is actually needed here for people to support them in future progress. So I mean, we also you know, get engaged with people who want to validate methods, standardize and validate methods, and we do support this. But this is still a lot of work. And the other one, which one should not forget, maybe stakeholder, also funding agencies, because we have funding agencies in Germany and Europe who fund also validation studies, for example, because at the end you also need some kind of financial support to standardize and validate your method if you want to go this way.
Mm-hmm.
I think just to start with. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Some comments from Tim or Susanne or OECD as well. Susanne first, yep.
Yeah, I try whether it works with video. Yeah, I want to support what Michael said, and I was thinking that it would be probably good to also already contact CROs in that phase, because it has to be feasible, also the study in the laboratory, and that you know that it can be taken from one lab to the other, and then also validation is of course very important. And yeah, to bring more people together, and funding is very essential, of course, because standardization is very expensive. Getting the ring trials done and so far. In the first step, I also think it's very important to really identify whether the method could be fit for purpose for a regulatory need. So this is also a very good question. And I think it's important to bring the different viewpoints together here, because it's not possible by one stakeholder alone. Yeah.
Mm. So you mentioned, Susanne, regulatory need. Tim, now you.
Sure, and I think the regulatory need is really critical. And what I might suggest for those people that occupy this space, this sort of the idea conceptualization, or people that are method developers, is actually to look at the standard project submission form, the SPSF, to get a sense as to what might be involved in putting forward a project proposal onto the work plan. And that may be very helpful in the context of having that initial discussion with the national coordinators of your respective countries. If you've got a good idea that you're putting forward, it might be really helpful to have that initial idea about what is the flavor and nature of the discussions that occur as the WNT considers what projects might be on its work plan. And so things like robustness. So does the method correctly identify the endpoint that it purports to identify? Is it reproducible? If it's a life science-oriented method, if it's is there a biological relevance behind what's being measured? These are the sort of discussions that I think are really important to be aware of in the context of that initial touch point with the national coordinators, who are the conduits, so to speak, to the OECD Test Guidelines program.
Mm-hmm. Good. So what I gathered in the moment was the researchers are important. They have some initial ideas that was mentioned, and those researchers bring the ideas forward, which can be diverse, and funding agencies are needed for the researchers to have these ideas, but also for the round robin first testing whether the methods are okay. Then there was mentioned, yes, it should be there should be a link to the standardization harmonization bodies. So to look for feasibility, which is also a task, if I gathered correctly, for the national coordinators, because they should be approached, and there should be a kind of check by them also whether there is a regulatory need. So with that, I understood, yes, we need also some regulatory people with a background on regulation and what is needed in the near future. Or if we talk about a development period of 7 years, we also may talk about midterm needs better, and long-term needs, and not short-term needs here. So this were somehow what I gathered, the different roles of these stakeholders during this phase. Do you see that similarly? And if yes or if no, please comment. And especially then, how are they currently engaged during this phase? How is it currently actually working? How is it currently actually ongoing? So it was mentioned from you all working in the WNT, you are approached by people. Are there any systematic approaches, any systematic initiatives coming from researchers or coming from regulators or coming from policymakers? Or is it something which happens? So, yes, Michael. And then Susanne. You are muted, Michael.
Sorry. Yeah, so it happens. So it can be spontaneous. But I mean, we should also not forget that a lot of European projects, huge European projects, which actually are funded, I think in the US it's the same, funded with an aim to develop new methods for regulatory purposes. I mean, we have the ASPIS cluster now going on, you know, in Europe, and we have PARC, which has been probably mentioned before, which is probably the biggest consortium ever built in Europe. And there's a combination of regulators, scientists, all kind of stakeholders involved in these projects, and obviously there's always the hope that from these projects something comes out too, which is also feasible for OECD to transfer into a test guideline.
Mm-hmm. So it happens, was what Michael was saying. Susanne?
Yeah, I wanted to say somehow the same. It happens, and it's also it's both. Yeah, you have those European projects where you see there comes the needs from the regulation, from the regulatory side, like for endocrine disruption. We did not have the methods, so we needed to develop them, and this is for thyroids and for other issues. So I think it's both. It's sometimes it just happens, but most of the time, also for nano, you see it developed to find the right stakeholders, and there is a process ongoing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tim, that certainly is a question whether that is totally different in Canada, where you are located, or and certainly if there are some other experience later on coming from different countries, more than welcome. But please, Tim.
Sure. So, I mean, it goes without saying that I'm a bit removed from the European project ecosystem, but as someone who's on the outside of that looking in, I do see that these European Commission, European Union initiatives do tend to produce quite a number of outputs, I guess, that are relevant to the test method development space. And so, from that perspective, I think these are definitely initiatives that have been successful. I think that there are fewer coordinated efforts like that from outside Europe. Certainly, the OECD itself is, and through the WPMN, is a good convening body for other countries that are interested in collaborating to do that, who are outside of Europe. So I know there's a lot of collaboration between Japan, the US, Canada, and others. But definitely, I think the advantage of having of being part of that European ecosystem is that there is a lot of potential collaboration that can result from some of these initiatives, including NanoHarmony. So that's my sort of outside perspective.
Yes, that was from the outside towards Europe, but also how is it handled in Canada itself? Is it something like you are approached just by occasion, coming from projects which were running in Canada or in the Americas? Or is it something where you have a coherent approach coming from regulatory side? Or is it, how is it happening? Let's put it that way. Or so in Canada, for example.
Admittedly, it's an ad hoc approach. It's probably not the best approach, but that's generally what's happening. So regulatory needs sometimes are communicated, but I'll be honest. Maybe this is a question that you'd get a better answer from our American colleagues, but from the Canadian perspective, we're a large geographic country, but small population. And so everything is proportional. So, great research initiatives, but we tend to operate in niche areas. So we find we don't blanket the ecosystem. We find a number of key areas. And so, for example, on the metrology side, our colleagues at the National Research Council of Canada are active in that space. But there's a couple of key pockets of research and innovation that we tend to focus on and try to do that extremely well and leave other things aside. So, but again, the process is rather ad hoc. There's definitely probably room for improvement for that. But again, it goes to resources, individuals, intent, needs, etc. So there's a lot of factors that reflect the way things are.
Great. So thank you very much, Tim. Just, do you, Mar or Anne, coming from the outside, looking into the process, what you experience from different member countries, maybe have some ideas how this phase 0, which is normally not at the hand or the knowledge or the side of OECD, how that is handled? Or do you have any experiences there or notice something?
Well, perhaps I can just brainstorm a little bit, but I think within the I see topics coming into the table by in different ways. So sometimes it's just that you have an individual expert that comes because he's interested in pushing forward a specific project, and then you realize that I mean it's not a mature topic, but then you realize that other experts around the table also approach to you with issues that could have some similarities. And I'm thinking, for example, right now within the WPMN, thinking how to handle advanced materials for test guidelines development. So it's still something that is very immature, but it's already being considered by several experts around the table. So in this sense, it's something that just happened, that happens perhaps randomly, but then within the Secretariat, what we can try to do is to try to connect those dots and engage this communication between those experts, and then see whether this could be something that for which there is more appetite to have a discussion with the broader group. So I think this is one example of the things that could happen. We also have, I think the fact that we have these meetings, I mean, I'm thinking more about the working party meetings, but we can invite other stakeholders. And I'm thinking, for example, if you think about ISO around the table, I mean, beyond the European projects, and just learn what they are doing at their end, and then again try to anticipate and to connect some of the dots. But sometimes what we can do is simply to encourage communication between different delegations, and sometimes we can also and we can see to which extent it can be brought to the table via a specific discussion, whether there is an internal webinar that can be produced or something like that. But I think it's how we start anticipating and learning from the interest popping out in different stakeholders. This is the way I have lived it in the WPMN.
Mm-hmm. So what yeah, Anne, please.
No, please go ahead if you had a follow-up question.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I agree with everything that was said for this phase 0, and I don't want to repeat, but maybe something where that is not represented here that is important to consider in phase 0 is for test methods that contain some innovation. Who is going to be the supplier, the provider of, in the long run, in the long term, of innovative elements? The test developer, you know, if it's an academic lab, for instance, they may not be interested in transforming into a startup company, so they may not fill that role. The CROs are the users, the consumers, I would say, of the methods, but they are not the ones producing, you know, the equipment, the material, providing the cell lines, etc. So when I think it was Susanne in the first place who mentioned feasibility, I would say in this feasibility consideration, conceptualization, it's also important to that a test developer, if he is a proponent, in discussing with the national coordinator, they also figure what's going to happen if this test method becomes a test guideline. Who is going to supply, who is going to ensure the maintenance of specific elements of a method. And we have some examples in the test guidelines program where this has become an important consideration before or sometimes after the test guideline was adopted. Who was the supplier of a test of a cell line, for instance. So It has not yet emerged as an issue for test guidelines for nanomaterials, but there's a lot of innovation. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the near future, this could also be, a question mark that comes, and it needs to come very early in phase one, I think, before a project is proposed.
Right. Very important point, absolutely. So it all burns down, if I understand that correctly, in the end, US national coordinators and at OECD level then have to decide whether something is to be continued with an SBSF or not, considering whether it's mature enough, whether it's practicable enough, and whether there is enough backup and regulatory needs. So quite some task for you to actually come to the point with evaluating. Do I phrase that correctly? As you would see your task at this stage from 0 to phase 1 as we define it, Michael?
Yeah, it's all right. And I just wanted to also to support what Tim said. I mean, there's also the possibility that people look at the SPSFs themselves, and because it's very nicely organized template where all questions are actually asked, also availability, I mean, IPR issues, which people often forget, that they can't use the cells for commercial purposes, even they use them for 20 years in their academic surrounding. And so it's, oh, they are not available. Okay, maybe they should be publicly available, right. or information should be publicly available. I thought so. Anyway, but yeah, okay. The conclusion is it should be available.
The blank template is available.
Yeah,
so
that's what I mean.
You can see the questions that are being asked. You don't necessarily see the responses to the questions from other projects.
So
no. The blank is available. That's what I thought. So, I mean, that is important.
Yeah. So that facilitates and helps your task as your national coordinator and to see whether it's worth to pursue or not, where all the information are collected, if I understood that correctly, Michael, correct?
Yeah, and it shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, the questions look obvious, but it takes a time to develop a project and develop the SPSF to a form that other people can actually follow and appreciate the project. So people also have to take the time to look at it and to develop it and discuss it with the national coordinators so that the SPSF submitted to the WNT is actually mature enough. Yeah.
Superb. So just reviewing a little bit what we have talked so far, we said we have the researchers, and it was nice, Tim, you were phrasing as the European ecosystem with the development of researchers and funding of these projects being needed. That already addressed a little bit funding agencies. At this stage, there we had the luck that there was some funding available. And funding is I think for any country, for any member country, for any initiative here, always a very, very big question. How is that really to be funded over a time period of 6-7 years, which is needed to actually get things going? The feasibility was mentioned, CROs being part of the development on feasibility, that there will be a possibility really in the lab that this will be done. And the national coordinators play an important role, and there should be a regulatory need. When we were talking then about the current way how the phase 0 is actually started, there was a lot saying it was by chance, let's put it that way. It's not really by chance because of the funding of some of the basic methods development, risk assessment, concerns, and so on, I think is something which is taken up by funding agencies with regard to basic research or applied research. there is a certain degree of funding which then leads to these types of method developments. There it stops. That's what I understood. There must be a good linkage then. But it was something like, as you said, you are approached on a kind of sporadic or just by chance, but there's no systematic approach. That's what I gathered. Especially from the regulatory side, we need this one, and we go in 5, 6, 7 years, we have these kinds of regulatory needs. That was what I gathered from what you were saying. And interestingly, there was not only coming from the national coordinator, but also within OECD, as Ma and Anne was describing, there are processes, activities, discussions leading to then some of the phase 0 discussion being actually part of something which happens at OECD meetings. That's what I gathered there as well. By example, advanced material was given, being pushed and coming then from itself, and not being really from a member country. Do you think then, to the last point here, is there an improvement, or would it be worthwhile to have an activity trying to link this phase 0 between the different stakeholders in a slightly more coherent way, or is it just let it run as we have it currently? And certainly this is only to you. And if you have comments within listening in, please feel free to comment also in this direction in the chat. And later on, you can comment also to NanoHarmony, because this is certainly not only something limited to the ones being present here today. So would you, Tim, for example, would see it would be worth to pursue this on international level or national level, to have this interplay stronger ongoing, or do you think we could leave it the way it is? Sorry.
That's, I guess, the million-dollar question. There's always room. Maybe I could give a non-answer in a way, but there's always room for improvement. I definitely think it's worthwhile improving the interface between test method developers and the process of international harmonization. I don't know how well it works in standard setting bodies, if there's any lessons that can be learned in that respect. But I mean, I think that we recognize that national coordinators wear a lot of hats. So I know maybe my colleagues could either confirm or reject this, but there's a lot of hats worn. There's a lot of responsibilities to fulfill, and sometimes it's difficult to dedicate the time and effort to specific stages of the work as you've laid them out in the phases. Sometimes it's like you're spinning plates, where you have to turn your attention from one issue to another quite rapidly and readily. Is there some advantages that you could impart through some more structured or systematic processes? Probably. How that would work across jurisdictions, I think we'd have to work out. I find, like part of my comments earlier was, we find that there's a great deal of coordination within the European family, but the venues for harmonization, cooperation, collaboration outside of that tend to be through other fora, such as the OECD. So we find that the OECD offers a convening function that allows for the same sort of thing that you're doing within Europe to occur on a broader scale. And so as someone who sort of as an individual country, sort of more or less in isolation a lot of the time, we find that participation in fora like what's offered through the WPMN and the Test Guidelines program offers us an opportunity to do that collaboration. The weakness, I think, is that some of that early stage development work between academic institutions or CROs or other industry players, that's missing. And so I wish I had a great solution that I could offer as far as how you formalize that early stage. I think we've done a really good job at the later stages, but I think we're still working on some of that early stage activity. Anne alluded to it, Michael alluded to it as well. There's a workshop taking place later this week where there'll be some discussions around topics that are relevant to this space, I think, a little bit peripherally, but I think there might be some lessons to be learned from that subsequent discussion that could come back and inform some of this discussion as well. So I think there's a lot of interconnected pieces, and I think that early stage, how you actually leverage the innovation coming out of academic institutions and others, is something that we're turning our attention to more and more in the test guidelines program. So,
thank you. Very good. Some other comments from the others, and I think Klaus, if you have some comments from the chats or remarks.
There's
Yep.
a few comments in the chat. Many of them are about the things that Tim just commented on, of how we link in the needs, the identification of the needs phase in parallel to the ideas coming up, so that we don't have to wait for the needs to be clarified first, then the funding program, then a project, then some ideas. But it's sort of some kind of, we talked about it when we went Paris, some kind of ideas board where needs go on at the same time as people put in ideas of techniques and new things that could be measured, so that you can kind of make a speed dating service and go, well, these two connect reasonably well, and you can get it into projects that are already up and running. Those are the main parts. There's also some good suggestions and conversations going on in the chat, but we have been 28 minutes on phase 0 now, so you have 10 minutes per phase for the rest of them if you move on now. I do like spending time on phase 0 because it's the one we have the most power over, I think, but we probably need to move along. There's nothing that hasn't been touched upon in the chat.
Good, very good, and well noted, and that was also my thinking. So we move on to the phase, to the next phase, if I manage here. Phase 0, project proposal and SPSF. That was already mentioned several times, that the SPSF is an important step. So when we come to this part of the project proposal and the SPSF phase, what are the main stakeholders that should be engaged during this phase? Is it still the same as we had before, or is it limited? So what do you think, who are the main stakeholders? We mentioned before researchers, funding agencies, regulatory needs, national coordinators, and standardization CROs. So which would you think are the most important one? And you see the list on the right-hand side of the slide as well. So with the project proposal and SPSF being still at the edge, I think this is something where maybe you, Anne or Mar, could have a first idea, and then we continue with the national coordinators and lead of the WNT.
Yeah, maybe I can start. From my perspective, this is where the dialogue between the national coordinator and the test developer, be they academic scientists or test developers from other horizons. That's where this dialogue is really important, so that the national coordinator can collect as much information as possible in relation to the relevance of the method, which regulatory need the method fulfills, what's the level of work, optimization, standardization, transferability that has already been done. All of that is extremely important to document at the stage of the SPSF, because this will be the work that is likely to consume most of the time, as many of you know, being involved in interlab comparison studies. So it is yeah, very important to collect as much information as possible, publications, peer-reviewed articles, conference material, posters, whatever, that documents the method. Yeah, and the dialogue between the two is important.
And perhaps if I can just add about what Anne just said, I mean, I think really the communication with the national coordinators is vital, because sometimes you come with a proposal on the SPSF, so they can not only help you to refine, but they can also help you to anticipate some of the issues or similar issues that have already been discussed within the working party of the national coordinators. So they can really help you to spot and to avoid repeating mistakes, past mistakes, or simply to connect with existing projects that are already underway and where this project could actually be a good fit and complement, and might be that this already might speed up the process quite nicely. So for me, that's the key players here are the national coordinators.
Mm-hmm. Would the national coordinators agree to it? Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, you know, there's a deadline, 15th of November each year. And it's actually very important to engage national coordinators early and not on the 14th or so. And yeah, you laugh. Sometimes it's not so funny. Susanne knows what I mean. And yeah, and I mean, actually, who should be involved? I think obviously one has to gather all information available, and one also has to check if it actually makes sense to submit an SPSF this year, for example. I mean, how much work is still to be done? How safe is it that this method will be ready in a decent time frame? You know, if there is no data on transferability or reproducibility, is a big risk that the project will drag on forever, because you might have to change the SOP, or I don't know. And so there should be clear that it's a robust method at least. And then you might need a check for IPR issues, which people often forget about, and then you need other stakeholders involved than normally. And yeah, so it depends on the maturity of the method, which level it is, and obviously on the complexity, what additional information you need. Yeah.
So in summary, the phase 0, the academic developers, test method developers were the key players, and then interaction with all the others we discussed before. Here it is said the key player is the national coordinator at the project proposal phase. That's what I gathered from your comments, was involvement of the academics, standardization bodies, and certainly member countries, which have to agree later on to this. Susanne.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Michael said, and I have 2 points. I think one important thing could be to have a joint project. That I have some collaborations recently, and that really helps in putting in the right resources in the projects. This is really, really good. Have co-leads in the project, and then it's more communication between the co-leads as well, and you have to think about that at the beginning of the projects or the SPSF. And the other point I forgot. I think about it, but that I wasn't on.
Just raise your hand whenever it comes up to your mind again. So you wouldn't, what I gathered here is policymakers and regulatory bodies are not the ones which at this stage, project proposal, SPSF, are relevant key stakeholders or relevant stakeholders. Is that correct? Tim first, and then, or Susanne, was it what came back to your mind? Oh, okay, then Tim first, and then afterwards Susanne.
I might just add that the regulatory needs drives whether something is taken onto the work plan. And so one of the things national coordinators do in the background between just November 15th and early January is to confirm through their own network of national regulatory organizations whether in fact a project proposal does have merit from a regulatory needs perspective. And that's a critical piece. So I wouldn't necessarily say at this stage that regulatory organizations aren't key stakeholders. I think they absolutely are.
Good. Thanks, Tim. Susanne?
Yes, I really support Tim with that, because also in the beginning, when I have a new project, I find out whether this has regulatory needs. So it's already in that decision of proposing an SPSF, of course.
So what I gather here is the view of the process, the view of the involvement of stakeholders seems to me a little bit clearer and more straightforward, with the national coordinators at this specific phase being really responsible, having a clear coordination task. And would you say then, and that would be my impression of what I gathered from the replies, that currently the involvement of the stakeholder groups during this phase is already pretty well, or do you see already some places where you think some more formality, some more options, some more possibilities would be great? So I would phrase this mainly just at this point of time to the national coordinators, and thereafter maybe what is the impression from those working at OECD? Would you agree from the national coordinator's point of view that the current step is well organized and is going okay? There's no specific need for improvements. Michael. Again, Michael, the micro is off.
Yes. There's always room for improvement, I would say. I think to raise more awareness of the possibility and challenges of this program would be really is needed. Is obviously also our job, and we do have a lot of presentations in Germany about the program, but still it's sometimes surprising how little people know if you talk to them. And so obviously communication has to be improved. I mean, I guess it should be on the national level easier than on the international level. So it's kind of our responsibility, but it's also not so easy. But I think that the awareness level has to be improved, at least here in our case. Yeah.
Thank you. And that is certainly something which we as NanoHarmony try with the workshop, to raise the awareness and to spread some information. So any further comments you would like to add with regards to this engagement of the different stakeholder groups at this stage? And maybe from the OECD point of view, do you think there's something at proposal and SPSF stage where you could see from your experience something improved, or everything is running fairly good or very good from your point of view?
Perhaps if I can add to the WPMN side. I mean, as Michael said, I mean, in the WNT, we have very strict deadlines, and there is a rationale behind those strict deadlines, so the program functions well. And I think the WPMN has provided a venue where there is a little bit more flexibility for initiating a discussion and to scoping a discussion on a specific need. I think perhaps if areas that should be perhaps further clarified, I mean, or further improve, is the fact that you don't need to go through the WPMN to develop an SPSF. I think it's clear that all the work that has been done, for example, in Go4Nano and other European projects, all the research that has been done behind, it's already been done. So there's no need to go to the WPMN. I think we always appreciate to be informed on new proposals coming up, because that might be the case where we can identify some joint activities or some complementarities between different proponents. But this is something that I want to make very clear. Mm-hmm. And this is because when we started doing this some years ago, we were not at the same type of expertise, was not at the same type of comfort in moving to the test guidelines program. So I think this is something that already could improve, and definitely we don't need to have a project in the WPMN that is just going to be there in order to get funding. That's not the purpose of the OECD. That's not the purpose of the resources that we have, and I think this is something that needs to be very clear. But again, I mean, the WPMN offers a venue for those starting to think about the maturity on FSPSF, to have some further discussion. That this is very much welcome. But at the end of the day, it's not the WPMN stamp that you need; it's the WNT stamp that you will need in order to initiate a project for a test guidance or guidance document for that. Yeah, I think that's something that has evolved over time, and is something that we're getting better, but there's still some room for improvement.
I think the discussion and the exchange on international and WPMN level is good, and the same as it's done at WNT. Susanne, do you still want to? No, that's fine. So for me, what I gathered, and if you have different opinion, please speak up. The phase 1 as a project proposal SPSF, and is one which is the key stakeholder is here the national coordinator, and certainly the one suggesting the test method phase. And here we need to coordinate the academics, the standardization bodies, the member countries, and the regulatory bodies. And this is, I think, really what I gathered here clearly seen, and the roles are relatively clear as well. So that currently there is good involvement, engagement, sometimes the discussion between the different member countries, and the way forward into it, raising awareness is a point which could be improved, which is directly then the step between 0 and 1, as I would currently see it. And that would be the part we identified as possible improvement. If I see nobody getting angry, then the summary was okay, I assume. And we can come to the phase, next phase. It's always interesting. Now it's working, phase 3 and 2 and 3. This is actually after the SPSF and before it is finalized as a test guideline or a guidance document. So all the work in between, which can stretch between, as I learned from Mar, a year, if something runs extremely well and smooth and is very well prepared and everything is already there, but it sometimes can end up for a longer period of time, 4 or 5 years. So which is a long stretch. And there the question is, we are here at the level when we have the actual development of the test methods. And I think this is a stage at OECD level. So from your point of view, Anne or Mar, who are the key players here, and who should get involved here?
You want to start? Yeah. Well, that's the phase where the project is implemented. First, there's a review of the SPSF where we collect feedback from other countries, and the national coordinators can ask, can consult their own experts. We also take the opportunity sometimes. If we know we have an expert group that is meeting, we take advantage of the meeting to discuss a little bit the upcoming SPSFs in November, December, and to collect some feedback and on the proposal. And then the proposing country has the opportunity to respond and modify their project proposal. And then during the phase 3, because I understand we are addressing the two here, phase 2 and phase 3, that's where there will be a lot of opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Sorry. And we also, I'd like to remind you also, when the more ready the methodology is, when it comes to the OECD, the faster the project will go, and the faster we'll get to approval of a new test guideline. There are public drafts. Also, we make all draft test guidelines, draft guidance documents, etc., available on our public website. We hardly get any comments back from the public, though. So I don't know if it's if we should advertise that more. It would be more work for the national coordinators, because we clearly orient any feedback to the national coordinators to build a national position. So we don't, from the Secretariat point of view, collect feedback from everyone ourselves. There's a clear guide to provide the feedback to the national coordinators. But I wonder if in this phase, whether national coordinators get any feedback from people they have not consulted themselves. That's for them to answer that question. But that's really where there's the maximum opportunities, you know, for stakeholder engagement, I would say.
And yeah, perhaps another thing, just because we have the opportunity to stress this, is like that really the experts takes the time to review the comments, to review the documents, because sometimes we have to go through different round of comments and they just miss the first two. And then when we think that we're ready, it turns out that the third commenting round comes out with amazing comments that jeopardize the implementation of the project itself, and that is a step. It's easier to have all these questions at the beginning, so the leads can actually incorporate them, because they're also spending resources in implementing this. And then you run out of resources because the projects just got extended for longer and longer and longer. Then you change, and then you start like these vicious circles where you have like change of leads at the national level, etc. So I think it's really important. I mean, you're going to be heard. We don't mind if the comments are complex, sometimes contradictory. We don't mind, but if you do them at the first time, it's very easy for us to have some kind of, to organize bilateral discussion, to have some teleconferences, to have very specific discussion on the points that are, where there is a conflict, than having that at a very late stage when you have all the research done, all the ILC performed, etc. So I think this is why the expertise is really needed, and where it also, I mean, is this communication with the national coordinators, that the expertise is maintained, because sometimes we have a lot of change of expertise coming out. We have distribution lists that become very big, and then we never know, we don't have the same, the input from the same experts. I think this is an area where we could, we still need to improve, but it's difficult to handle.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael is going to kill me now.
No killing here. Absolutely not. And Michael would switch on his micro this time.
Did I? Okay.
Yes.
I mean, what Mar says is, this is actually what we also discussed at the beginning already, is it's a matter of resources and capabilities. I mean, it's not so easy, actually. There are, times where we get a lot of documents at the same time for checking. Like, we get these 15 SPSFs, and we have until January to check them all, and which is good. I mean, which is feasible. But people go on vacation, or people change jobs, and or people are sick, and it happens a lot that people are not available for the review, and or have other obligations. I mean, it's not that people, at least in our institute, they do that in their spare time, so to speak. And this is a problem. I think to have sufficient large available expert pool to have a thorough and comprehensive review of projects and potential problems. And that's when it happens that in the second round, new people come in and they have a fresh look and they see other things than in the first round. And it is difficult, but that doesn't make the arguments they come up with less valid. So yeah, but I think resources is an issue in this process.
Susanne.
Yeah, I want to thank Mar for that because
Susanne, would you mind to switch off your video?
At the beginning.
Because
yes, I will. Is it now better? Sorry.
Absolutely. Now it's clear.
Sorry. I wanted to point out that I really want to, that it's really important, and it would be great to have all the comments in the first instance, but it's also a question whether we have the validation already done before the SPSF or whether that's the next step after the SPSF. And of course, the ILC, that will take a lot of time, and sometimes during that process, funding expires, and then we have difficulties in the project. So it's it would be good to have all the issues on the table as far as as soon as possible. Yeah.
Right. So we have here as a key stakeholder, our stakeholder being mentioned, the OECD experts, the national coordinators, again, with resources and funding. And I've heard from Anne that this is actually where the most of the engagement is possible. If I think that's the words I heard from you, Anne. So the question from my side is, if it is where most of the engagement is possible, who's actually taking care of it? So who is actually then the key person really addressing industry, addressing CROs, addressing researchers, addressing OECDs? So who is actually then responsible at this stage that this kind of stakeholder engagement is really taking place?
Well, most of the time, either there's an existing expert group or we create a new expert group if those that exist do not have the right expertise. And we ask for nominations to a new expert group. And we have nominations from member countries, from NGOs, including industry. There's really a good opportunity to have this broad representation of those who may like to use the test guideline when it becomes a test guideline. Those who would like to, who have some experience with the methodology, who know the science behind, and who would like to contribute to the development. So our expert groups are quite large. They represent several member countries. Of course, not everyone who has necessarily something to say on the specific method ends up in the expert group, because also, it's voluntary work. So we have to acknowledge that and factor that in, because it's going to be, it can be a limiting factor. People spend time, they don't necessarily get, an academic recognition for all of that work. So it's, it's a trade-off. Those who get involved need to weigh in how much time they can dedicate. Will they have the time to review all of these documents? All of that is done on a voluntary basis. So of course they are paid by their institutions, but certainly not by the OECD. So And at the OECD we manage, we coordinate the way we work with the lead country. the lead team to organize their work, to communicate with the expert group, or more broadly, we organize some webinars as well to promote the work. Yeah, so there are plenty of opportunities to get engaged either actively or maybe more passively, just for getting access to information.
Right, great, good. Any further comments, remarks you would like to add with regard on stakeholders, groups, involvement, engagement, and who is key stakeholder here? I think we have really identified quite nicely that the leading country and then the expert groups are the one which have to facilitate the engagement from the different stakeholders at this stage. And even there, we have in the beginning and the end, we have different phases where maybe some specific other stakeholders can be addressed beside the OECD experts and the scientific experts to be involved in the development and the interlaboratory comparisons and what else is needed there. And this is where also it was said, what I understood, yes, at some cases it would be good. There's always room for improvement, as Michael and Tim were saying, if I remember correctly. Some more engagement, more information of those, and giving the opportunity to participate at a different and important step within the development. That is something which we should consider and maybe put into the minds of those who are developing the test guidelines more repeatedly, because it's always different people, or not always, but often different people who are actually then working on the actual test guideline development. With this, we may come, or not may come, we will come to the last phase, which is the phase 4, the test guideline use. And that is something, yes, there is an exploration, who is actually going to use the test guideline. We had a webinar where we were asking, where is it formally integrated, the test guidelines, in this case for nanomaterials, in national or in state legislation and so on. But that we, at that point of time, it was something like a feedback mechanism. Is the test guideline really being useful, or is there something which has to be changed? Is it something which is not usable, something like this? This is also what I gathered from those meetings. It's something coming sporadically, or not coming if some people approach the national coordinators or OECD, but there's nothing really systematically. So the main stakeholders at phase 4, the use of the test guideline, if you don't agree, please add, are the CROs and our industries and are the researchers who want to apply these test guidelines. Do you, and this is to all of you, get a feedback on test guidelines which have been published recently or 20 years ago, and you get a feedback on regular basis, or is it something sporadic? So that would be a question we have. And is there something like a regular review necessary? And if yes, which stakeholder groups should be involved in this one? So this is something where nobody feels directly addressed. Yes, Michael, and thereafter Anne.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it happens. I mean, there are updates of test guidelines rather frequently. I mean, whatever you call frequently, but if test guidelines are published and there are problems with the performance or availability of components, national coordinators, I don't know if Secretariat is also approached, and then this is discussed, and there might be adaptation of the guideline in different respects. I mean, I think this we had like almost every year last couple of years, so it's not so uncommon. I mean, the discussions about a constant review process, I mean, this is good. This is also a matter of resources. right? Because this is there are hundreds of test guidelines, and this is something one would have to find the resources for, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Anne?
Yeah, just briefly, just to follow on what Michael was saying. This is a question we asked, I think it was last year in 2021 or 2020, to the Chemicals and Biotechnology Committee. And their response was that it should be a light review. They didn't want to formalize the review process more than needed, more than what is currently in place, because it's a matter of resources to organize that, of course. So we get some comments. Sometimes we get some questions. We sometimes identify through the feedback we receive from random users. We identify errors that are present, and we correct test guidelines. We don't need an SPSF from a member country for that. We ask everyone to let us know what needs to be updated, what needs to be corrected. If these are substantial updates, usually they would need an SPSF, because if it involves some additional work, if it changes the method or the data interpretation, then it should be the subject of its own project. But more formal process than that, we don't have, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Anne. And Susanne?
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, because in Germany we initiated a project to review all OECD test guidelines for the environment part, and we now are finalizing the report, and we saw that there were a lot of issues raised for around 500 comments on the 55 tests. No, I don't know, on the test guidelines. And so there's a lot of work now to do to get that into the project, or get that into project, and also to find out whether there are more generalizing things that are applied to more test guidelines, or whether it's specific to one test guideline. And yeah, I think it was an important project to see how much work that will need. And also one of the results of the project was that there's a great interest from the experts outside to feedback to our test guidelines and how they're used, and sometimes, yeah, we have to discuss it. And I think it's of course it's a question of resources, and we cannot do that every 5 years, I think. But yeah.
Very good. Certainly resources question again. Tim?
So just really quickly, 2 points. One is just to put everyone's mind at ease to some extent, that the WNT makes corrections to test guidelines every year. Every year there's a correction of some sort. It's almost a standing item on the agenda, whereby there's a collection of different corrections that need to be made, and that's dealt with very efficiently, I think, every April. The other point is, notwithstanding the fact that there are real constraints around a formalized mechanism to sort of curate the array of test guidelines we have, there is a conduit, again, to restate the obvious, through national coordinator. So if CROs encounter issues with performing a test guideline after it's been adopted, the easiest way to bring that through for consideration is to contact national coordinators, either individually or jointly. And that happens regularly, often. I know colleagues have brought for discussion, even within the Bureau of the WNT, fairly regularly, issues that have been flagged by CROs. And so I guess the reinforcing point is that as people experience issues, because that's bound to happen, that it's worth not resigning yourself to the fact that a formalized process doesn't exist, and in fact, just to speak up and to raise it either to the Secretariat or to the national coordinator.
Great. So with that, I think I would stop also with phase 4 and come to an end and just give a short summary, and then I will ask you for a final sentence, which will then finalize this roundtable, and which I certainly appreciated very much. The time flew by. You already noticed what Klaus was telling me, spending too much time in the beginning. So we had to quick up a little bit later on. So with the summary, I'm not going to give any summary, but it's a point, I think, therefore the question marks. Importance of stakeholder involvement and contribution in all phases. I think that became clear. We have discussed, exchanged it, and we saw that different stakeholders at different times need different involvement. There is always room for improvement. And here, certainly, at some points, we have to keep that in mind. And overall, something like what Michael was saying, awareness is always important, which also is part of the last bullet. But before coming to the last bullet, is facilitating further engagement of stakeholders by regular information workshops sensible? Is it important? Is it needed? It's something I think we all will go out of this round table with the feeling, yes, it certainly is good to have those. And how important, where to stress it, where to leave it as it is. It's something we have to consider and think about. But overall, at least my impression is the whole process is extremely well thought through. There's a very good coordination through all of the different phases. At the same time, some engagement, awareness, some workshops to spread the information, which is not only part of the OECD, clearly said as from the beginning. I think this is something we all have to do together. Something like what we did today and maybe tomorrow can be seen as a start of it, in view that we help to facilitate this kind of engagement and spread of information. And I think also what we gathered, there is a lot of trust in the whole process. There's a lot of trust in working here together. And this is something we can really build on and can be proud of also, about the trust existing on OECD test guideline developments, and which we can use really to work on in the future as well, on possible updates, improvements, or whatsoever what comes up with regard to the OECD test guideline development. Now my question is one of the big questions is in which order to ask the last sentence. And the last sentence, I would leave the ultimate last sentence to Anne, so it will be most difficult for you, Anne, to find a new formulation for a last sentence. And we may start with Susanne, and then I would go along how the pictures are. Yeah, the pictures of you are on my screen, and I would start with Susanne, and the next one would be Michael then. So Susanne, summarizing last sentence on this issue.
Yes, thank you for this initiative. I think discussing this together with all stakeholders and to get a thorough overview on what is needed is very important. And I think that has been done here. So great, thanks.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, also totally agree. And also one workshop doesn't solve it all. I mean, it doesn't mean that one shouldn't continue trying. So I think these kind of activities are extremely useful. Thank you.
Tim.
I'll agree with both of my colleagues and look forward to continuing the discussion, because as we've said repeatedly, there's always room for improvement. So we're always looking for opportunities to take on new suggestions and new procedures that can make our lives collectively easier. So thanks again.
Lovely, Tim. So Mar, as a surprise, the next one.
How can I summarize this? I think that there, as it has been said, there is a lot of room for improvement, but there is a lot of improvement already achieved in the past years. At least this is my experience. I think the only thing that I would like to say is just like for those listening, reach out. I mean, I think we are super busy. Everybody's super busy. You are super busy, but everybody's really open to receive queries and to try to answer and to try to include you in the work if you are interested. The more the merrier. Another thing that I do want to thank is perhaps COVID, but also NanoHarmony for helping us to outreach to a broader community. We have been doing some webinars jointly, and also this has triggered at our end a number of webinars to further advertise new test guidelines as they are made publicly available. And this is something that I think has encouraged even the phase 4, for which I don't have anything much to add. So I think that the discussion that will need to follow, it has to make this exchange sustainable. I mean, where NanoHarmony comes to an end, what comes next to make sure that this dialogue continues and that we can continue reaching out to a broader audience. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And certainly on international level. Anne. Your micro, yeah.
Well, just I'd like to acknowledge how the nanomaterial community is organized, and how you where you have been in the past years very conscious and engaged to develop test guidelines, to get the funding also for getting these test guidelines, these test methods first standardized, tested to demonstrate their robustness, etc. And I think it should serve as an example. So if you have also tips, recipes, how you manage to get the attention, get the funding in the first place. We know that for a lot of other hazard endpoints, there's really a need to develop alternative methods, and money is an issue. So I think you achieved a lot through your various projects, and you engaged a lot in test guidelines. So I think that's quite remarkable, I would say.
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for your very kind words to the activities and to this session. But the thanks goes absolutely back to all of you, Susanne, Anne, Mar, Tim, and Michael, for your contributions, for your willingness to participate, for your willingness to answer all these questions openly here and have this kind of exchange. So thanks a lot for this one. And certainly this will follow up in something what we try to pursue within the next half year to get something like what Anne was saying, Mar was saying, some sustainability in this kind of efforts. We are working on that one and trying that. I would like to excuse me for not having opened the questions platforms enough to all those who commented in the chat. All those comments in the chat are not in vain. They will be dealt with, and we will answer those as far as needed, and we'll come back to you as far as possible within the next due days. So thanks for all the comments from the chats, which will be all also used within building the legacy of NanoHarmony as it was introduced in the beginning of this workshop. With this, thanks to all of you, and I pass on, and I hope Elizabeth is not too much angry that I took her 10 minutes for summing up the day, and I think 5 minutes even overdue to the whole schedule. But Elizabeth, you may pick up and jump in now and do the roundup and of this day, and maybe introduction for the next day. Thanks to you all.